Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be addressing this prestigious group on such a historic day. Mark Pritchard is a good friend of mine, and he does send his apologies. I think he's got a very good excuse, which you've already heard. But he's very sound, I think, Mark, and I do commend his courage on our cause. Also, it's great to be with Peter Hitchens again, who really is a rock of sanity in a sea of insanity on so many occasions, and writes so well and illustrates our cause so well. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to start by saying about this debate today that I do regret it was made a three-line whip by all three parties. I'm sure we all share that position. It seems to me that this didn't arise from scheming backbenchers or people trying to sort of oust anyone. It came from the people, and I did commend the initiative of having these referenda, or the chant of having a referenda driven from the people through petitions. And there were a major number of signatures for this. And I thought the purpose was to have a free vote where the people's opinions could actually be voiced on the floor of the Commons. And I do regret that. I don't think this wasn't a binding vote. It won't lead to instant legislation. And I don't really understand why this was done. So I do regret that position. I actually would say, though, that I personally obviously am arguing for an in-out referendum on EU membership, but I do fear that we have one too soon, i.e. 6 months or a year, that our cause would not win it. Because if you look at the history of referenda, what worries me is whether you look at 1975 or the AV referendum, the most recent one, is the status quo won. And actually, with the AV one, the polls, they lost about 15% of support for AV during the course of that campaign. And my belief is that I think it will take us 2 to 3 years to actually build a case for getting out the European Union. And therefore, I'm more relaxed about the timescale. Of course, this bill didn't have a timescale in it. And so, pushing it back a few years, as long as we are campaigning in that time frame. And the idea of the positive vision booklet that the Chairman Kai mentioned, and there are a few at the back, and I've got a few extras, and we can always send you these, but the idea of a positive vision was that as Eurosceptics, we often get criticised for being too negative. There's a lot we can be negative about when it comes to the European Union. But actually, I think we have to paint a positive, credible, alternative, realistic vision of life outside the European Union in order to win that referendum. I don't think it's going to be enough to just bash the EU, because we almost won that battle. Even the Lib Dems want reforms, let's say. But the positive vision, I think, is something we need to get across, and I want to say a bit about that tonight.
Surely it's been done by Norway. They don't do that.
Indeed, so. I mean, there are some things we can point out on that. Before I just touch on positive vision, I just want to, the general scene I wanted to touch on where we are now. Clearly, the Euro crisis springs to mind as number one. And I think what's significant about that, particularly speaking as MEP, is the fact that the Euro, as you know, has always been a political project, not really economic, right from the start. That's why they turned a blind eye to allowing Greece in the first place, because it was about politics, and it was about forcing integration and federalism, which I know the Bruges group has done so much to oppose, quite rightly. And because it's a political project, because they turned a blind eye to the fact you are trying to force together, to mesh together, very divergent economies, like Germany and Greece, obviously, or Portugal and Austria, it was inherently unstable. And the implication was you will have to have a fiscal union. And my belief, what I think is significant about this, firstly, I do believe the euro will collapse. I've heard the counter-arguments, but I do believe it will collapse in full or in part, and probably quite soon. That is economically bad news, I accept that, we shouldn't celebrate it, but politically I think it's good news because it will liberate a lot of these European nations like Greece, like Ireland, who are caught in a prison because they cannot devalue and they cannot set their own interest rates. And I think that is deeply dangerous for democracy. And what seems to be happening at the moment is that democracy is reasserting itself, with even the Germans saying, we've had enough, we don't want to pay for any more bailouts. As does the Slovakians and Slovenians, wherever you look, as well as the Greeks. And I think democracy is back in charge and saying no more bailouts. You cannot go on in this manner. And my real worry is that if you're going from a banking crisis to a sovereign debt crisis, you might have a European central bank crisis, a central bank crisis next. Because if you're printing money or you're buying junk bonds, where does that all end up? I'm sure you and Bruges Group have some ideas on that. I think another thing that's very significant, over August, I noticed that George Osborne announced essentially a two-speed Europe. Now this has not been the policy for a long time, but the idea that you can allow the core Euro nations to move forward to fiscal union, it seems to me to be extraordinary because by definition we will have to change our relationship with an inner core, with Germany at the heart of it. So I think we are into a very interesting period. I call it shades of grey, and this is what I'm finding amongst MEPs, is that there's more and more discussion of all sort of different variants of renegotiation or withdrawal, depending on how you define it. And I think we're into shades of grey, because if you have an inner core arising from this crisis, then we will have to redefine our relationship anyway with the European Union. And in my view, when you talk about renegotiation, if you keep on renegotiating over so many items, you will end up with what I want, which is a free trade agreement between Britain and the European Union. I'm on the International Trade Committee in the European Parliament. There are 53 of these agreements already. We've just signed off the South Korea one. There's India, Canada, Malaysia, a lot of Commonwealth countries in the pipeline. So why not an EU-UK free trade agreement? We are the single largest trading partner with the European Union. £40 billion deficit. There's a lot of talk of losing 3 million jobs. Well, if there was no trade between us, they would lose 4 million jobs for the 3 million we would lose. Now, I don't think there will be a trade war. I think you'll have a free trade agreement, and that's what I strongly argue for. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is a historic time, and things are really serious on the euro, and it's a huge opportunity for us. And if I may just then touch on the thrust of positive vision, because it starts by saying, if you look at the Europhile arguments, it starts with the great myths. In here there's the 10 great myths, as we've called it, about why we can't leave the European Union. And I think the first thing we have to do is knock down those great myths. And they start with that 3 million figure. You've heard it from Gordon Brown, you hear it from all sorts of people. But of course, if you have your free trade agreement, you're not going to lose those trading jobs. And the 3 million, it's 10% of the economy, our economy, that relies on trade with the EU. 10% of 30 million jobs. There's another 10%, which is the rest of the world, trade with the rest of the world. But remember that 80% of this economy, which is the world's 6th largest, 80% of this economy is nothing to do with international trade at all. It's you buying British goods and services from other British citizens. And this is overstated. So when people talk about, half our trade is with the EU, we must be a member, the first thing to say, well, hang on, it's only 10% of our economy. And we can, I'm not saying throw it away, I'm just saying a free trade agreement can secure that position anyway. So that myth, the 3 million jobs myth that we all hear, is absolute nonsense. And the gentleman there touched on Norway and Switzerland. Well, you know that Norway and Switzerland per head export more to the EU than we do in Britain, and they're not in the EU. And Schengen, Switzerland is in Schengen, the Schengen Agreement. We are not, but it's not in the EU. So there's a lot of flexibility already. The second myth is about that Britain will be left on its own, isolated. Well, we invented globalisation, didn't we, in this country? All around here, we have a wonderful crest downstairs, all the Commonwealth countries we've traded with through the years. Japan is the third largest economy in the world. It's not on its own, is it? It's very globalised, it invests all around the world. I don't buy this argument. We have the largest financial centre in the world in the City of London. We have a portfolio power. The G8, the G20, the World Trade Organization, Security Council of the UN, one of 5, the IMF, Board of Governors, at the heart of the Commonwealth, 54 nations. We're never going to be on our own if we leave the European Union and have this free trade agreement. And when we talk of influence, or losing influence, well, Baroness Ashton, bless her, is closing down our embassies around the world and replacing them with the EU embassies, the External Action Service. And they want our seat on the UN, and they want our seat on the IMF. So we're losing influence already. And then they'll say, oh, but we'll lose foreign direct investment. You know, we'll lose all of that investment. But you know, the greatest investment in this country is from America, from the US. And you know that when it comes to projects, investment in projects, the top 3 countries, none of them are EU countries. They're America again, they're Japan, and they're India. You know, Tata, for example, Jaguar, and all of that. So they're not even EU countries, this investment. And Ernst & Young last year did a survey to this, which found that there were key factors, nothing to do with the EU, key factors of the UK culture and values, the City of London, US relations, there were infrastructure, telecoms, transport, that sort of thing. Those are the key factors, not membership of the EU. And then another myth, they say that, well, you could leave the EU, but you still have to pay for it, and you'd have no influence over it. Well, we have 8.4% voting power now. Doesn't that make you feel strong? 8.4%. I'm one of 72 MEPs out of 736. And I can tell you, you know, when it comes to a lot of the directives now, we have no influence. The Fund Managers Directive, for example, is making a mess of the City of London. That's 80% of fund managers are in this country. But 72 British MEPs couldn't stop it. The Temporary Workers or Agency Workers Directive. Again, 8 out of 10 flexible workers are in this country. Again, we couldn't stop it, even though it's very undesirable. So we don't have that kind of influence now. And when it comes to actually changing your laws, well, Norway has only made 49 changes to enact 3,000 EU acts. And when it comes to costs, Switzerland, well, yes, it costs them 600 million Swiss francs, but it saves them net 3.4 billion Swiss francs every year. And then the greatest claim of all, finally, in this section, is about guaranteeing peace. That we left the European Union, would all be at war. I believe that democracy and NATO have secured our peace. NATO predated the European Community. It was 1949. The EU actually only represents 27 out of 47 European nations now. There wasn't a war between 1945 and 1956 before the EU was actually created. And NATO is being undermined, and when the president of Germany, the former president, was saying that, you know, with the amount of legislation coming from the EU, he doubts now whether Germany is a parliamentary democracy anymore. That worries me. I'm sure that worries you too. So I think this is a huge overclaim about peace. You know, we're all in favour of avoiding war, but, you know, there are other ways of doing so. So ladies and gentlemen, just to turn now to the freedoms. Those are the reasons why we can leave, by knocking down the myths. What about the freedoms? The first one is to restore our national sovereignty and control. I'm sure you're well aware that 100% of fishing, farming, trade, EU immigration, 100% of that is now controlled by Brussels. And in many other areas, you're talking between 50 and 80%, depending on estimates, of laws on the economy, employment, social, transport, you know, even road safety in Britain is now, they're trying to control it from the European Union. And the environment, of course, emission targets and all of that, that's all coming now from Brussels. It was very refreshing recently to meet the former head of the Liberal Party of Australia. And, you know, when they have a policy like immigration or trade, they can do it because they're self-governing. And we've lost touch with that because we have to be subverted to this bigger layer. The second great freedom, in my view, is that of resources. You know it costs us £17.4 billion a year to be in the EU. The net cost is 48 million, sorry, the gross cost is 48 million pounds a day. The net cost is nearly 7 billion. It's going to go up to about 10 million. That's a net cost every year. That may not sound huge, but when you think of it, it's 44 new hospitals a year. It's 268 new schools a year. It's 1p off income tax. It's 1% off VAT. Or it's halving the deficit over 2 parliaments over 10 years. That's how valuable this contribution we are making. That's the net contribution, which is not coming back our way. Then there's the freedom to do our own trade deals, thirdly. I'm on international trade, as I said. I can tell you some of these free trade agreements are being loaded now by human rights issues, by emissions targets, by lots of political stuff that shouldn't be in trade agreements. And we, in Britain, cannot do our own trade agreements with countries around the world. So David Cameron has done a good job going around these countries, India and China, Russia, quite recently, taking the lead on business, but Britain cannot do its own trade deals with those countries. It's done by the EU. And I believe if we did do our own trade deals, there would be more free trading and far more beneficial overall. And then one of the biggest freedoms, fourthly, is the freedom to deregulate. I know this is a particular bugbear of the Bruges group, and you've done some great work on the cost of regulations. There's 100,000 laws coming out of the EU, directives, decisions, judgments, and regulations. And the working time directive alone is £12 billion a year is the cost. It's not a cash cost, but it's a real cost. That is equivalent to the international aid budget when you look at it in cash cost. Over-regulation is between 4 and 10% of GDP. It could be as much as £118 billion a year, according to Taxpayers Alliance. This is a huge benefit. We left the European Union, the 90% of our economy that has nothing to do with trade with the European Union could be stripped of those regulations. That would be a massive bonfire of regulations. Briefly, the other freedom, just to wind up, we could save the NHS. You may not all like the NHS, but we could save the NHS from your healthcare directives, from the working time directives causing havoc to it, from the dumbing down of standards. In my own constituency, Dr. Abani killed 2 of my constituents by the dumbing down of standards. You know, that is all bad news, and we could save the NHS, and I don't think the NHS can exist within the EU system, and that's quite a big message to get out there. And we could regain control over our legal system. We are being taken over by Europol and Eurojust and the external European arrest warrant and the investigative order, all of these things that are commanding our police, commanding our courts, undermining habeas corpus and our traditional judicial system. And finally, cutting prices for consumers. You know that the emissions trading scheme alone from the EU actually costs every household £117 a year. That's just one aspect of all this massive environmental legislation. The landfill directive, which drives up council tax, does so by about £50 each household. When you start adding all these things together, water, energy, transport, and food, of course, it has a huge impact on consumer prices, and all of that could be addressed if we left the European Union. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to conclude, one thing I would say, people often say it's too difficult to leave. You know, it would take years, it would be messy. Well, the first thing I would say, technically, we could leave in a day. We could repeal the European Communities Act, 1972, that Ted Heath, that wonderful chap, gave us. We could get rid of it in a day. In theory, I prefer to have a free trade agreement in place before we do that. But it is feasible to do this. And a free trade agreement, as the EU's largest trading customer, could be delivered on, and I think that's the way to go, and it would solve a lot of our problems. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are at a historic moment in our relations between the EU and this country, especially today. We've reached a genuine tipping point, and I do believe that we must seize this opportunity to change our destiny for the better. I think we got into the European Union through a lack of faith in ourselves, a loss of belief, and a sort of post-Empire, post-Suez loss of faith in ourselves. And it's about time we address that. It's about time we obtained our freedom back. Thank you very much.